On behalf of the Department of Political Science and International Relations and the Warburg program, we'd like to welcome you today to our discussion on, well, what we call the crisis in Ukraine. It's an ever-evolving situation. There's all sorts of titles we could put to it. My name is Dr. Leanne Doherty. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the chair of the department. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today as we engage in a conversation that I think will be ongoing for quite a long time around the ever-changing situation in the Ukrainian country and the role of Russia in all of this. Are we headed to a new era of a Cold War? Are we headed to something bigger, longer lasting, etc.? Well, hopefully our experts today and friends and colleagues will have those conversations and lead us. So the format today is we're going to be joined by 4 colleagues who are going to discuss the situation from different viewpoints. Dr. Sarah Leonard is the chair of the history department here at Simmons and was part of the crisis in Ukraine conversation in April 2014. So the more things change, the more things stay the same. She's going to start us off with a historical overview of where we are right now, because we need to know our history as we continue forward. Retired Ambassador Tom Dougherty is our Warburg chair, and he's going to go second and give us an overview of the diplomatic developments relating to Ukraine since the dissolution of the USSR and the implications on the current situation. Dr. Abel Amado is a member of the Political Science and IR department. Abel will address the international implications beyond Europe and North America, with particular emphasis on Africa, which often gets ignored in many situations, and so we're delighted to have him talk about that. And maybe some of you don't recognize, but Dr. Michael Cronin is here from Monmouth University in New Jersey. Dr. Cronin was a Fulbright Scholar at the National University of Kiev in 2019 and 20, and is the director of the Masters in Social Work program at Monmouth. He currently also serves as the United Nations Commissioner for North America for the International Federation of Social Workers, where he leads a team to raise global awareness about social issues, including aging, the family, health, and mental health, social development, status of women, youth, and human rights. So just a minor job, Michael, that, no issues at all. Thanks to Professor Gary Bailey for facilitating his participation today. And we look forward to his perspectives from recently living in Ukraine and being in regular contact with friends and colleagues, as you just alluded to there. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Sarah and start our conversation. If you have questions, throw them in the chat. We'll take questions afterwards as well. But just keep on your toes, and as I will watch the CNN ticker as we're having this conversation at the same time. So Sarah, take it away.
Sure. Hello. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Leonard, as Dr. Doherty said, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm in the history department. So I'm going to give you a kind of quick run through some information about Ukrainian history. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So just to talk a little bit, first of all, I just want to mention that I'm drawing heavily from a book by Anna Reid, which is called Borderland, A Journey Through the History of Ukraine, which I highly recommend if people are interested in this. And because
Sarah, you're muted for some reason. I'm sorry, friend. There we go.
Now.
Yes, I can.
All right, great. Do I need to start from the beginning?
No, you said you were taking it from a book, Borderland, A Journey Through the History of Ukraine. That's the last.
Exactly. Great. So I'm drawing on her book, and I really recommend it. So I just wanted to begin by saying that the Ukraine first becomes a sovereign nation in 1991. After the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so that's probably an important thing for us to know. Obviously, the Ukrainians exist, the Ukrainian language exists, and in many ways we could say that the Ukrainian nation exists. But as a sovereign state, it is quite young. Anna Reid talks about the idea that of this kind of how it was that the Ukraine thought about itself as a nation when it began. And she writes, Ukraine's situation in 1991, when it was breaking away from the Soviet Union, was not unique. The collapse of the Soviet Union came as a shock to all the Soviet nationalities, including the Russians themselves. Each newly independent republic had to reshape itself from top to bottom. divided between rival powers for centuries. There's actually lots of parts of Central and Eastern Europe that were kind of divided up between different empires for centuries. They were faced with two tasks: state building and the creation of institutional paraphernalia of statehood. And they shared this with lots of other ex-Soviet nationalities. So just to begin by saying that this is, the Ukraine is in the business and has been in the business of kind of nation building. Hang on one second. I just have to see if I can advance. Okay, so just a little bit about the Ukraine. The Ukraine arrives at independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union with a history of division and trauma that was punctuated by sort of brief periods of cultural flourishing and a few flashes of independence after World War I. So after World War I, it had a very brief period between 1917, 1918 to 1920, where it actually had some sovereignty. And then it was incorporated into the newly emerged state of the Soviet Union. Unlike Central European and Eastern European, other kind of Central European and Eastern European nations like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the Ukraine was not an independent nation until late in the 20th century. And instead, the Ukraine spent most of its existence annexed by multinational empires. Including then in 1920, the Ukraine became one of the Soviet states of the Soviet socialist, it became a Soviet socialist republic. And the history under the Soviets was quite difficult. There was division, there was famine created by the collectivization process that happened of agriculture in the 1930s. There were political purges under Stalin. There was horrible violence and genocide in the Ukraine during World War II, excuse me. And then also it was the site of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. So I just want to give you a sense also of just where the Ukraine is and a little bit about sort of its development as a nation. So this was, you can see that this was an area that was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This was an area that was given to Ukraine or that was granted to Ukraine as a sovereign state by Poland, areas that were granted to Ukraine by Romania. And then also this area right down here, which is the Crimea, became part of the Ukraine in 1954 and is also a highly disputed area where there is a large ethnic Russian population. There were many ways that the Ukraine went about sort of imagining a nation. Language, as some of you may know, is very important in terms of creating nationhoods, particularly when you have been dominated by empires. Galicia in the West has long been kind of a center of national culture. And in the 1830s and 1840s, there was a flourishing interest in the Ukrainian language, which has been actually very important to creating a kind of sense of nationhood. And there was also, and the Ukraine was also lucky because during that very brief period after World War I, before it became a Soviet Socialist Republic, it actually created a Rada, or a central council, which allowed for them to have some history of having built political institutions. And so when in 1991, the Ukrainian state became independent, the Rada turned into the Ukrainian parliament. Just a couple more things to talk about the Ukraine since 1991, since its independence. In 1991, the members of the Ukraine voted to become an independent republic and to break away from Russia at that point because it was no longer the Soviet Union. And just to mention, it was the second largest economy among the Soviet Socialist republics. So this was in some ways a loss. In 1994, the Ukraine began to cooperate with the US and Russia in a transfer of nuclear weapons away from their territory. And in that process of de-arming, nuclear weapons, they received assurances for protection. And they began to develop relationships with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and this began to stir tensions with Russia. Another thing is that in 2006, there were a lot of tensions surrounding the kind of energy interdependence. There's interdependence between Russia and the Ukraine. Russia shut off the gas supply to Ukraine, which really affected the economy of the Ukraine. But it sort of goes both ways. Power goes both ways here, because 80% of Russian gas exports actually flow through Ukrainian territories. So there's also that piece. Russia is kind of vulnerable in that sense. In the first decades of the 20th century, there's been quite a bit of political turmoil and accusations of corruptions within Ukrainian politics. This is also a period that's been marked by deepening ties with the European Union and with NATO that have sparked further tensions with Russia. And in 2014, this was when I was on another panel, Russia seized control of the Ukrainian peninsula of the Crimea, which I showed you is at the sort of in the bottom of the screen that I showed you, which is ethnically largely Russian. This, by the way, has never been acknowledged by the international community or by the UN General Assembly. So this is also an ongoing source of contention. In 2017, the Trump administration funneled aid and weapons into the Ukraine. And in 2021 to 22, Russia began to amass troops along the Ukrainian border. So I am going to sort of leave it there, and I'm going to stop sharing and allow my colleague, Tom Doherty, to talk more.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm really particularly pleased that Professor Leonard could be with us today, because I think her presence here emphasizes one of the messages that I wanted to convey, and that is the crisis isn't new. When we were talking about doing something on the current situation in Ukraine, I discovered that in 2014, there had been a panel called The Crisis in Ukraine. And it was very nice of Dr. Leonard to offer the perspectives that she presented then and now. But beyond that, I think I want to point out, particularly to Americans, since we don't have a very long attention span with certain things, that the crisis isn't new. It didn't start a few months ago when Russian troops started massing on the borders of Ukraine and Belarus. It didn't start with the illegal annexation of Crimea. It didn't start with the violence in Donbass over the last couple of days. It's gone much further than that. And I think this is why sometimes the perceptions of people on the ground are very different than ours. Probably worth noting that if you were in Ukraine, you would know that more than 14,000 people have died in Ukraine since 2014, fighting in the area around Donbass, of which about 4,500 are Ukrainian troops. And to put that into perspective, that's twice as many Americans died in Afghanistan in 20 years. So for them, when they're saying this isn't new, you can understand why. But I'd like to go much further back than that, because I would say this is a crisis that's been in the making for about 30 years. And a very well-known writer about Putin, who wrote a book called Putin's World by the name of Angela Stent, who's at Brookings, actually has made the point very clearly. And I'm going to read it because I think that outlines exactly where we are now and where we need to go. She says the crisis is about the future of the European order crafted after the Soviet Union's collapse. During the 1990s, the US and its allies designed a Euro-Atlantic security architecture in which Russia had no clear commitment or stake. And ever since President Vladimir Putin came to power, Russia has been challenging that system. So really what it is about is the European security architecture that's been in place since then. And I think what I was going to offer to do in 4 or 5 minutes is just maybe some of the main diplomatic perspectives from both sides, because if we are going to avert more violence than we're already seeing in Ukraine, there's going to have to be a diplomatic solution. And so in that sense, it's really very important to understand the stances of both sides if there's going to be any progress whatsoever. So probably worth remembering, way back in 1991, especially for students, the collapse of the Soviet Union caught people off guard. It was very, very sudden. In retrospect, it all seems to make sense, but at the time, it was very, very quick. And the first President Bush was president at that time, and with Gorbachev, who was in power at that time. At the time the Soviet Union collapsed, the three Baltic states, it was the last act of the Duma under the old Soviet Union, were given their independence, and that was sanctioned by the USSR. But the expectation was, and kind of the hope even from President Bush, and certainly with Gorbachev, is that of the remaining 12 Soviet republics, most of them would go into a voluntary confederation or federation with the Soviet Union. That was what was initially thought and planned and hoped for. It obviously never transpired in the way that the initial thinking was, however. But what was clear at the time is that the Russians' understanding is that there would be no new NATO expansion. In fact, and surprisingly, the Russians, old Soviet Union, new Russians in 1991 and 1992 wanted US troops to remain in Europe, wanted NATO to continue, because they saw that as a counterbalance for what their concern was, a unified Germany. Initially, they wanted no NATO troops in the old East Germany. They agreed to that, but their understanding was that would be the end of NATO. By 1992, President Bush was talking about the New World Order with a benign hegemon, the United States. And it's interesting to look at it now because it shows a degree of naivete. What he said then in his State of the Union was, for the world trusts us, the United States, with power, and the world is right to do so. So that was the framework that the European structure of security was framed on. Sarah alluded to the 1994 agreement called the Budapest Agreement, which is actually really very important. Again, what many don't know is that when the Soviet Union fell, the third largest nuclear power in the world was Ukraine. Not because that they had developed it, but because the Soviets had stationed more than 100 ICBMs in Ukraine, was the third, and thousands of missiles. So Ukraine agreed in a deal brokered with the US, Russia, and the UK to return the entire nuclear stockpile that the Soviets had had in Ukraine, but with a guarantee that their sovereignty would be respected and their political independence would never be threatened or interfered with politically. Clearly, that part of the deal the Russians are not living up to and haven't been living up to it for a long time. Later into the Clinton administration, there was a feeling that NATO should expand. And although there were many people at the time that said this was a very bad idea, including the ambassador from the US, Jack Matlock, who was ambassador at the time that the Soviet Union fell, saying it would be the most profound strategic blunder that we could make after the Cold War. Likewise, George Kennan, who was the architect of the containment policy after World War II, at 94 years old, testified before Congress as well, not to expand NATO. A decision was made to do so in any case. Again, with the idea from America, almost a Wilsonian rather than a realist idea of liberal democracy, liberal world order versus pure realpolitik. So by 1999, 3 new countries had been brought in: the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland. More countries would come in 2004, the Baltic states, as well as Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And the Russians protested each and every time this happened, saying this wasn't what our understanding was going to be. By then, Putin had become president. He became president in 2000, and he came in with the mandate, which he said was, I am here to restore Russia. And this was seen as a good thing because The 90s had been pretty corrupt. There'd been a lot of disorder. And for a short period of time, people thought, all right, well, this might be a positive development. What we learned instead was that Putin's attempt to restore Russia in his own mind has much to do with the recreation of the old Soviet Union and an imperial looking major power of Russia. By 2007, it couldn't have been clearer, and this has been much commented on in the press lately. Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference, at which point he outlined exactly what Russia's position was. They were incontrovertibly opposed to a unipolar state led by the United States, and particularly pointed out that the US was not the hegemon that was as benign as people had expected. Remember, this was during the worst parts of the Iraq War in 2007. So he started saying he was going to abrogate some understandings, agreements that had already been out there. And in fact, he did so, first starting with the Conventional Arms Forces Treaty. What was really critical, though, leading up to this is in 2008 at a NATO conference, the Bucharest conference, then President Bush, the second President Bush, indicated that he thought that Georgia and Ukraine should and would be entering NATO. This was controversial at the time because they weren't ready. People weren't expecting this to happen within a year or two, but he opened the door to it. The conference ended with the declaration that the two countries someday will become members of NATO. And again, what we tend to forget sometimes in the United States is within months of that, Russia invaded Georgia in the same sort of manner that they've just invaded Ukraine again, went into two Russian ethnic breakaway states, granted them independence from afar, even though they were part of Georgia, still recognizes those two states and had soldiers in Tbilisi, in the capital of Georgia. So again, nothing new in this, and looking at the situation with the two breakaway separatist republics in Ukraine, very, very similar. Two or three other points I'd just like to make before handing it over to Professor Amado is that from a Russian perspective, the US was instrumental in bringing down a democratically elected government in 2013 that was pro-Russian. I don't think anyone would be on firm ground making a strong case for the type of governance that the prime minister then was leading. But the US, again, in support of democratic principles, had been working in Ukraine, especially in Ukraine, but all throughout Eastern Europe, to bring in, to bolster civil society, and had been accused by the Russians and the then government of Ukraine of siding with the opposition. That government was ousted. From the Russian perspective, and the way it's taught to Russians to this day, is it was a coup d'etat supported by the Americans. He left and a new government had come in. Very shortly thereafter, the illegal annexation and the fraudulent referendum took place in Crimea. That brings us pretty much to where we are today. That's been continuing since 2014. And probably just worth emphasizing, because again, if there's going to be any type of diplomatic understanding on this, the baselines of the Russians, which they knew the US and NATO would not accept, are no new NATO members, a guarantee that Ukraine and Georgia will never become members, and along with that, not talked about very much, that would include Finland and Sweden too, in case they're ever interested, and that troops would move back to where they were in NATO in 1997. In essence, what's called the Putin Doctrine by Angela Stent is getting the West to treat Putin once again as if Russia were the Soviet Union. Where Stent sees things going is no matter what happens, there's going to be a recalibration of the European security structure. This will be the third. The first, of course, was at the end of World War II with Yalta. Then the architecture that was created in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in some way, shape, or form, we're looking at that again. The Obama ambassador to Moscow during the time of these events, Michael McFaul, has called on looking for a diplomatic solution, has even proposed something that he would call Helsinki 2.0. Again, an international summit that would reward unjustifiably, in McFaul's opinion, but nevertheless necessarily bring Putin and other leaders to talk about areas of commonality and where we could go forward. So with that, I'm going to pass to Professor Amado and look forward to your questions later. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Doherty, for passing the mic. Hello, everyone. Professor Amado here, Abel Djassi Amado. I'll go by he, his, him. And today I want to challenge you to look at the crisis in Ukraine, not from the perspective of the center or those involved, but more like perspective from the periphery. There's a lot of that has been written on how the African continent and African states are on the periphery of global politics, on the margins of international politics, even among scholars. I mean, there is a great book edited by Dunn some 20 years ago. The title is very suggestive: African Challenge to International Politics. It looks at some of interesting theoretical framework for us to understand how African international politics indeed can help us understand global politics. What I will attempt to do in the next 5 minutes or so is try to unpack how Africa is positioned vis-a-vis this crisis. My presentation is titled as the crisis in Ukraine and Africa between salience and silence. Between silence in the sense that I want to emphasize that the conflict impacts political economy and impacts the diplomacy of African states. So this is something that I will briefly unpack, and then I will try to understand some of the reasons of the African states' silence vis-a-vis this particular crisis. In regards to the first part of my talk, the silence of this conflict in Africa, I want to perhaps call your attention to a statement made by Boris Johnson. I don't agree with man a lot, but I think that he nails it when he says that the shock of invasion would echo around the world, right? I mean, that's definitely is going to impact the African continent, and as such, that shows that the conflict could easily spill over on the African political economy, or even in terms of political position. There's not much in terms of trade between Ukraine and sub-Saharan African per se, but as we know, Ukraine exports a lot of agricultural products to the Middle East and to North Africa. So one can make the argument that a conflict would probably means that sub-Saharan African states will have to compete with Middle Eastern states and North African states for new sources for to get food for their own people, if you will. So that in itself gives us an idea of some of the possible outcome, direct outcome onto African continent. But I also want to mention that we can find some direct consequences of the crisis in some of the African states, particularly the case of South Africa, the most expressive state in Africa when it comes to economic and political power. Has the crisis in Ukraine was unfolding, that affected directly political economy of South Africa, and its own currency suffered a blow. In fact, the government of South Africa responded that it was paying close attention of what is happening in Ukraine. So there is a direct connection in this particular case, though the connection, as I mentioned, may not be direct in regards to other states, but in the case of South Africa, they do have, they should pay close attention of what is happening in Ukraine, because that apparently will have a direct hit on South African economy and on South African financial system, if you will, as we saw with the rand, South African rand suffering a blow. Now, I also want to emphasize the issue of silence and how the crisis is important, and perhaps to pick back a little bit on what Ambassador Doherty mentioned. When you said that Putin, his new policy is to restore Russia, I want to emphasize that the path of restoration of Russia passed through the African continent, in the sense that we'll see that in the past 2 decades or so, and more recently in the past decade, Russia is back in Africa. It's back not only in terms of its diplomatic presence, back in 2019, Russia had Russia-African Summit, but also in terms of military presence. The conflict in Mali, you had a number of Russian mercenaries fighting in that conflict, and many reporters and scholars who are following this event very closely makes the argument that these mercenaries are part of this company, which is owned by one of the close associates of Putin. So I want to emphasize that in this part of this geopolitical restoration of Russia, Africa does play a role, which again, it's another way of saying that the conflict in Ukraine has an impact on the African continent. Now, the other side of my presentation is looking at the response of the African continent. So if my hypotheses are correct, the crisis is salient to Africa, we need to ask ourselves, how are Africans responding? How are African international organizations, particularly the African Union and individual African states, responding to this crisis, which it's not local. I don't think we can classify that crisis as local. We have, the involvement of at least 2 or even more nuclear powers in that conflict. If that conflict is not properly managed, the consequences can be destructive, not only to Europe, but to other parts of the world as well. Now, I want to suggest that African statesmen and stateswomen have been silent on the following the silence is the result of the following factors. And when I say silence, this is, recently we had 2 major gatherings, the summit, the African Union Summit, or even the European Union, African Union Summit, which happened last week. There was pretty much no mention of the crisis in Ukraine. So nobody talked about it. In regards of the summit of African Union, which happened a month ago, while they talked a lot about the situation in Palestine, pretty much nobody talked about the crisis in UK. So I want to suggest that the reasons why African Union and individual African states are being silent on the crisis on Ukraine has to do first and foremost of this new Russian policy. Russia has indeed designed and implemented this soft power vis-a-vis African state, and one can make the argument that Russian policy in Africa this day follows a little bit what China did, starting in late 1990s and early 2000s, emphasizing political and economic assistance without any type of strings, meaning that aid are provided without any type of conditionalities, if you will, okay, which something that the Western states have changed. Aid to the African states typically are linked to political conditionalities, as we know. So that can be one reason that help us understand why many African states are being silent on this issue. Russia soft power and the increasing influence of Russia in many states, Burkina Faso. If you allow me just to footnote the impact of this Russian soft power, it is very interesting that a few days ago, when a coup d'etat was staged in Burkina Faso, you could see ordinary people waving Russian flags on the streets. I mean, this in itself tells us a lot. It shows us that, the extent that Russia is indeed winning in this war to conquer hearts and minds of African population, celebrating a successful coup stage by waving Russian flags. So that's one reason that we may want to pay attention to Russian soft power. The other reason that perhaps Africans are being silent on this case, it is because of this core principle of African political diplomacy, that regional problems need to be regional solutions to regional problems. So since the 1960s and particularly in the 1990s, the dominant principle of African conflict resolution has been emphasized that Africans themselves need to come up with the solutions for their own problems. So one can make the argument that this principle is extended to other conflicts in other regions, meaning that the crisis in Ukraine need to be addressed by Europeans themselves without interference of Africans. And the second possible unpacking of this principle is, by not intervening in the crisis in Ukraine is one way of not inviting, international powers into the conflicts that are happening in many parts of the world. Finally, the third main reason why I believe major organizations in Africa, particularly African Union, and individual states are not responding to the crisis in Ukraine has to do with the manifold political crises that we see in Africa. Perhaps the more recent one is the wave of coup d'etat that we see happening in different parts of the world, and the ongoing crisis in Ethiopia and in Sudan, etc. One can make the argument that African Union and individual African states have their plate full of their own problems and perhaps may not want to spend the scarce political, diplomatic, and material resources to deal with what's happening in Ukraine. So what I try to do here is to challenge you to look at the conflict from a different perspective, from outside, from a peripheral area, and to help us understand a little bit what what is this conflict is all about. I'm open to respond to any questions, and now I'll pass the mic to my colleague, Michael Cronin.
Thank you, Professor Amado. Thank you all for inviting me. I'm really glad to feel like I'm back in Boston. I did do my undergraduate at Northeastern, and I lived right across the Fenway on Peterborough Street, a stone's throw from Simmons. So I feel like I'm back home anyway. I'm giving you insights from personal Michael Cronin, and none of my views, which are quite biased, are, reflect Simmons University, Monmouth University, or Fulbright. So you're getting me, the real deal. Where I come from is the United States, of course, and I am a social worker and now a social work educator, and I'm a baby boomer. So the only thing that I knew about the Soviet Union and that area was the Cold War, and that one was good, one was bad, perhaps evil. And that we should be afraid of nuclear or whatever, and nothing else. Interestingly enough, I was always brought up, we were told we were Russian descent, a third generation to the United States, to New York. And then later found out it wasn't really Russian. It was Austria-Hungary. And then I really further found out it was Galicia, which Sarah talked about, and the Ukrainian side. And so that would be my great grandmother coming from that part of Western Ukraine. Other side of the family I know definitely were from Minsk in Belarus. And then later on, I found out there was a great uncle from Kiev. So all of a sudden I had this interest in Ukraine, and I will share with you that I was dating a man from Ukraine before going there for my Fulbright. And of course, we're now married and we're together here in the United States. So I am going to talk about my experiences from living in Ukraine for a year and a half, and what it's like even up to today, as we're up every night talking to family and friends about the situation. First thing I want to talk about is language. I learned very quickly that the use of language can be very powerful and misunderstood, and it sort of labels you and could be respect and disrespect. So I made a conscious effort that when I didn't speak any Ukrainian, I maybe had about 15 words of Russian in me. And I did not be able to read Cyrillic. And so I immersed in while I was working at the National University. And I also was part of my Fulbright capacity building grant was with the National Ukrainian Red Cross Society as well, building psychosocial support as a disaster mental health leader. And so I chose to take Ukrainian, even though Russian would probably get me further around the world, but it was a conscious choice that I was picking up on, that Ukrainian should be what I should be, learning. And I later learned that it actually got me further, okay? Even though Russian is widely spoken in Ukraine, more so than the East, the West is predominantly all Ukrainian. Kiev speaks a lot of Ukrainian. The area where the current President Zelensky and where my husband's family comes in, Kryvyi Rih, is Russian speaking as well. However, if you hear Russian from a Russian and you hear Russian from a Ukrainian, it's distinctly different. They know you're Ukrainian. And if you speak Russian from Russia, you can almost say, well, that's St. Petersburg, that's Moscow, or whatever. So I really learned that. And some of the first things that I learned is to try to gently correct people that it is not the Ukraine. It's called Ukraina, so it's Ukraine, because the Ukraine comes from the Russian transliteration, not the Ukrainian. And it's Kyiv, K-Y-I-V, not Kiev, which is the Russian transliteration of that. So that was like some of the first slaps I got, gently, as I started to, I call this the Ukrainization of Michael Cronin, really knowing nothing to really learning about history, and then my own history, and then the history of the country, and then, really matching that with professional development as well. The other thing is that my Fulbright scholars that are back, from my cohort that, have been in Ukrainian studies and teach now in universities across US are saying, well, you're not calling this a crisis. Okay, that's the wrong word. And I know that Tom asked me, is there a better title? And of course, I didn't have that conversation until after we spoke, Tom. But it's the continued aggression and occupation and war that's going on. And if those Ukrainians that understand what's going on are like relieved that finally the world is seeing this has been going on since 2014. Okay, there's also historical trends about how Ukraine has been poorly treated and trying to be destabilized. I mean, you can go look up something called the Holodomor, which there's movies that were done about, I think more recently, which was a purposeful planned genocide of a fake famine, and all of the food that was produced, where it's just the big bread basket and food producing agricultural state of Ukraine, was supplying all the Soviet Union, and any farmer couldn't eat their own livestock or food, and they would be shot if they could, and so they were starving to death. And this was a planned genocide that was fake. And so you could see that even in modern times now, that Russia has been trying to destabilize and continue to destabilize Ukraine, from economy to misinformation to disinformation. While I was living there, I would see, there were like bomb attacks in Kiev, and they, it was from, never knew what it was from. I have to say the Russians are quite clever in cyber terrorism, where they continue to use the same software that they used in the United States to take over Ukrainian governments and send messages to people. One of the most recent ones that I just was hearing about was that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was giving these messages to people in Ukraine that they have now uploaded all of their private information, and sort of like, which is not true, it didn't happen. So lots of things to help destabilization. So this is an ongoing thing, and the crisis started long ago, and now it's just finally it's gotten the attention. The Russian party line is that this is the U.S. aggression and the West aggression. Okay, and that U.S. is using Ukraine. Okay, Ukraine is quite patriotic. Putin, they are seeing that Putin is rewriting history. Okay, the history that I recently learned, I knew when I was reading his essays that he's saying Ukraine is Russia and we are the same people. When I am like, I did a good historical background, and I remember that the empire of Kievan Rus, which was the original area of Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, I think some part of Moldova, as the big empire, that predates like the 800s, at that point. And the seat of power was in Kiev and Kievan Rus. And so I also saw some pictures that if you look at 900 AD up into 1100 AD, you see beautiful churches and palaces, in Kiev. And if you look at Moscow, it's forest. Nothing was built there. So I'm like, understanding this is sort of a programming that didn't, that's not what I learned, unless I learned the wrong history. I don't think so. Russian news is quite powerful. Leadership, I have to say, has been weak. They elected a president that was a comedian actor that was in a very popular Russian-speaking series that I did watch every episode of. And he has no government experience except that he played a teacher that all of a sudden became president of Ukraine. Okay, because of some viral video that came about him, saying that we should take over, the people should be party of the people, which he actually named his party, that. And he wasn't smart enough to bring really good people to help him do that, like the show did. Okay, where, he just was the puppet of all these good people, and he just brought his cronies and friends. And so, it's a time where Ukraine needs really good diplomatic leadership, and there's a big question mark there about even where the loyalties are. Okay. I know that Tom could tell more about that. There has not been a full ambassador to Ukraine in the United States for 3 or 4 years. And it's being led by a term that means someone's in charge, right, in French, but they have not been vetted by Congress, and so that sends a message too, is that, what message is that for Ukrainians, even though Biden is giving very strong messages about supporting Ukraine, although not on the ground. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the things that, so I told you what I saw. I talk about language, talking about that, my work with the Ukrainian Red Cross was about trying to build psychosocial capacity, specifically with the forced migration of Ukrainians out of Donbass. And they went west, which was like a whole new language and culture. And there really was no integration programs. The drug abuse and substance abuse and crime went up. They really were just like, you're in a safe place, that's it. They really felt like Ukraine just sort of left them and is not really defending Donbass region and having it back. Those that could not leave were systematically forced to become Russian citizens. And what they're doing now in these last 2 weeks, I think, is they're putting people on a bus, offering them $138 and saying, you'll come to Russia, you'll become a citizen, and then you'll be able to access your Ukrainian pension, because before you couldn't do it as in an unrecognized state. And so Putin has been using what he thinks is clever law to justify the illegal annexation and invasions of a sovereign nation, Ukraine, and that there were people that, it's poor agricultural nation, and that part of the area was, poor, and they're Russian speaking, and so they found people to become paid separatists and were given a good salary and supported by Russian tanks and military, and to make havoc and to say that they want to be a breakaway republic. Okay, and those Ukrainians did flee that could, and those that couldn't essentially were forced to say, yes, we want to be that. There were elections at pretty much gunpoint. Okay, and so now the Russian parliament just passed that they are recognizing the breakaway states and therefore have a reason to now take over all of Donbass, which is not even the occupied territories right now. So we're really looking at that. So Ukrainians, my family, they're from the rural Kryvyi Rih in the village. Some educated, some not so much. They don't have television. They don't have time for that. They have to get up at 4 a.m, feed the chickens, do everything, go to work. And they're caught up in their own bureaucracies of their own work and life. And, really have little, my family there has little understanding of what's going on. It's not what they're really thinking about, even though my husband and I are trying to do an evacuation plan. We're trying to put together a plan where, we get Granny, who's 93, in the city of Kryvyi Rih, and everybody's about 40 minutes out in the village, my sister-in-law and mother-in-law, all very close and loving, getting them west to Lviv and then to the Polish border, which is now open to Ukrainians for leaving. And then having our uncle, my mother-in-law's brother, who lives in Latvia, to drive and pick them up. And then we hope to take at least 2 of them to the US as a refugee, is our plan. Okay. So uncle, right, is totally Soviet Union. He grew up in the Soviet Union. He was in the Soviet Union Army, and was stationed in Latvia, met and married a Latvian woman and never came back. He speaks very broken Latvian and speaks only Russian, and is ensconced in a Russian community, which is quite large in Latvia, and only sees Russian TV and Russian news. And, he was the only one in the family. No, don't take the vaccine. And if I ever do, it'll be the Russian one. Luckily our family in Ukraine did take the vaccines. And he was like, well, are you going to drive to the border and pick them up? And he was like, why? There's nothing, why would you do that? And in fact, so they'll put a new president in, it'll be fine, and does not see anything wrong with the annexation of Crimea and Donbass. It was like, he's Soviet, really. And so that was the first spin on our family plan, is that this is not going to work. And so we've been in touch with friends and colleagues in Kiev. Is a lot more urban, intellectual. They're reading all kinds of news. They're a bit nervous now that the missiles that are in Belarus now are in striking different distance of the capital. We know Putin wants Kiev. Okay, he's always wanted Kiev. And so that is now very possible, and they are nervous. Many of my colleagues who have family in the West are starting to go that way. And this is after being like nothing will happen, because it's been going on since 2014. And it's just the world media that's getting panicked. But now it's really showing that, they need to start preparing. Governments are moving their archives west. My husband, who was a former high-level federal prosecutor, they know that they are shutting down and moving their archives out. The U.S. Embassy is only on essential workers. Fulbrighters have been repatriated. So it's definitely a place of nervousness. So today we got a text that my husband has been keeping in touch with of our friend that lives in Donetsk City. Okay, so which is under the Russian occupation, and he was forced to become Russian, and all that. That 2 days ago when we texted, there was nothing going on, and knowing about the fabrication of that Ukraine is about to invade, and that's why they had to do this. Today's text was they're stopping every car that comes down the street, and they're pulling out all males and forcing them to become part of the Russian army. And I believe Professor Gary Bailey reminded us that conscription, I think he was calling that, giving us that word for that. So that's going on right now in terms of being forced to be in the army, being told that Ukraine is about to invade, or so that they can invade, so to speak. I think I've given you a hodgepodge of what my experience has been like. I could probably speak for 2 hours about that, and we only have 30 seconds. So I'm going to stop and let the program conclude, and I'm so happy to answer any questions as well. Thanks for this opportunity to find, to get it out sometimes. Yeah.
Michael, thanks very much. Dr. Doherty just texted me. She has a 2 o'clock class. And so she asked me if I would take care of questions and answers, and said, from now on, we should just automatically make these sessions an hour and a half. So if other panelists are able to stay on a little bit longer, I realize that not all of you may be able to, but for those questions that do come in, if you set them in on the chat, we'll go ahead, and I know I can stay at least for another 30 minutes. So we'll go from there. And I see first 2 questions coming up. Question from the group from Hannah Klein. A colleague of mine from Poland has shared concerns about the crisis as it approaches her home. If the conflict in Ukraine worsens, do you think the conflict would expand into Poland? If so, and at what point do you think NATO, US would get involved? I'm happy to jump in on that one. Poland, as a NATO member, all other NATO members would be obliged to come to Poland's defense. So where I think that there is a good deal of concern right now among NATO members in Eastern Europe, Hungary, for example, but Poland as well, is that there could be great masses of displaced people from Ukraine that would be coming into their country. But any violence on Polish soil, according to the NATO Charter, would mean an attack on one is an attack on all. So looking for...
It would be foolish for Russia to do that, because then that inflicts, the article that, NATO actually can strike. So.
Great. Other questions? We have one. Does Ukraine regret giving up nuclear weapons? Michael, did you hear that when you were on the ground there? I would imagine there are a few people today, and I know that Zelensky said something like, well, maybe we should be thinking about nuclear, but it's a little bit late in the game from that. But was that even discussed while you were there?
I think they're still traumatized by Chernobyl. Clearly.
Yeah, and I would guess that we would all say the problem with nuclear weapons is you really can't use them unless you're welcoming annihilation. So it probably wouldn't change facts on the ground now.
I think we often forget that Ukraine was the site of Chernobyl, right? That's part of their history, and it is really important. Yeah, that makes sense that they were traumatized.
Yeah, because they were totally used, mistreated, and lied to, and lost a lot in that. Yes, I've been there, and I saw the old villages, and got a real historical background of this, and it was a non-traditional tour. It was really about someone that lives there and knows what these villages went through, and it's a lot more than the HBO special, but the HBO special was quite accurate according to them, and even worse, kind of thing. I see a question that says, what should we do? And my students been asking me about this too, and others can answer this too. I think the best thing we can do is to disseminate real information, that this has been an ongoing issue. It's not all of a sudden a blown up crisis. It has geopolitical ramifications with China and Taiwan, because they'll be next. North Korea, who knows, and any other autocratic state, that they can do this, and that could be a dangerous rise. And I'm saying is to go to your elected officials and continue to say, support Ukraine at any length. And I know I'm going to have to pay more gas price coming up, and I know it's not the president's fault. It's not that. It's because of supply and demand. And I will take that as knowing that this is what we have to do. So I guess really trying to tell your elected officials as they continue to vote on sanctions and things like that is that we need to support Ukraine, because it's a world issue. I also am putting in the chat a book that I'm reading right now that is by a well-known Ukrainian writer, Sergei Zadan. It was just this year translated into English, and my colleagues say the translation is impeccable. He's a wonderful writer, and it's a novel set in Donbass as the beginning of the separatist rise, and it gives a lot of insight of that for a whole year, no one knew what was actually going on. They were just knowing, why were their schools being bombed by people speaking a funny Russian, and why were their flags being taken down? And it was really and it really is giving me a lot of insight about that early time. I'll let other people speak now. Thanks.
I don't know if all the panelists are seeing the very good questions that are coming in, but there have been a couple questions about China and Taiwan. And Michael just mentioned that. Certainly, I think we all know that the Chinese would be watching this very carefully, and we all remember the love-in between Putin and Xi at the beginning of the Olympics in Beijing, where they said that their partnership would have no limits. So clearly there are repercussions, as Professor Amado said, that go beyond just Europe. I don't know if others have anything they want to add on that.
Yes, I can just say absolutely. It seems to me that China is paying close attention to how this crisis or aggression or whatever you want to call it is unfolding, because one can make the argument that China may have thoughts on how to finally resolve the issue vis-a-vis Taiwan, and see how the West and the United States responding to this particular situation can, in a way, inform how China is going to move forward in terms of this historical conflict it had with the Republic of China or Taiwan. I see that there is a question by Becky in regards of parallels of China's programs and influence in Africa and compared to the case of Russia. If I may just respond to that, but unfortunately after that I need to log off. I'm scheduled for another meeting at 2:00 for the administrative board, which I'm part of. So which I apologize for not being able to stay longer. But now, in regards of the parallels, as I mentioned earlier, one can see a lot of similarities. The fact that a partnership between China and Russia and African states are often delinked from political conditionalities. This is something that is very different from the approach taken by major donor organizations and donor states from West. As you know, when it comes to the political history of the African continent in the past 4 decades or so, it is clear that liberal democratization in West Africa and in other parts of Africa can also be understood as the result of pressure made by major international organizations such as World Bank, IMF, and donors countries like France. Now, China from the get-go often emphasized that it's not my business to interfere in your domestic political architecture. We're here to help you. And we, there is no string attached, if you will. I think that this is the approach that Putin's Russia taking vis-a-vis African states, providing support without paying much attention to what is happening in terms of domestic politics for a number of reasons. I don't think that one can say that Putin is a friend of liberal democracy or a lover when it comes to liberal democracy. So he himself or Russia himself has nothing to gain whether liberal democracy becomes the dominant game in town or the only game in town. So ideologically or even politically, there is nothing to be gained in promoting liberal democracy. Actually, one can make the argument the opposite may help Russia's geostrategic positions in the African continent. Okay, and finally, because this is one area that I research a lot, which does not get a lot of attention, is looking at the African continent as an arena for global linguistic competition. In international politics, we often pay way too much attention to the issues of security, the issues of trade, and so on and so forth, but tend not to understand the geopolitics of language. Both Chinese and Russia are now trying to find a position on the African continent. And I want to conclude by emphasizing, for instance, how nowadays there is a big network of the Confucius Institute, which is the Chinese, it's a part of the Chinese government tasked with language spread policy. It is found all over the African continent. we do not know what's going to be the future of Mandarin in Africa, but certainly China is promoting the Mandarin in Africa, and perhaps that can be another way of reestablishing or maintaining itself and gaining the trust of ordinary men and women on the African continent. And this is something that Russia is also doing in terms of bringing back the Russian language to Africa. During Cold War, it was very common to find many language institutes, Russian language institutes in Africa. Many Africans did speak language, including from where I'm originally from, just to use a footnote. If you go to many parts of Angola, Guinea-Bissau, etc., you'll find a number of people that are fluent in Russian, but then there is a kind of a gap, which I think that Russia want to return to these states. As I mentioned before, unfortunately I will have to log off, Tom. Thank you so much for the invitation, but I had other commitments, so I'm already late to the other meeting. But if folks want to email me with other questions, I'm more than happy to respond them by email. So thank you so much.
Professor Amado, before you go, I wanted to thank you for putting a lot of depth on this ripple effect. And I'm glad that you're bringing in the African issues, that Russia has had ties with many African countries. Most of the doctors have been trained in Russia that come back, and you're right. So this ripple effect, thank you so much. If I can answer the Belarus question really quickly. Isabella Santos asked, thank you, why are Russian troops also around Belarus? Belarus has been run by also an autocrat, Lukashenko, and has been pretty much, has turned into a puppet of Putin at this point, and probably now has lost control of his own country. And they have moved Russian tanks to the border of Belarus, which is the closest to Ukraine, and two of those positions are in missile striking directly to Kiev. So it's a strategic, and Lukashenko is not in charge of this. Putin is.
Maybe just one thing I would add on Belarus as well is that, and it gets back to one other question that Professor Thompson had asked about what is Russia's bottom line. And it's a tough one to answer because only Putin would know that. But certainly there are a lot of people that think that what Putin at the minimum wants is a sphere of influence, a zone of influence that would incorporate Belarus and Ukraine as kind of a frontline buffer area from NATO. Belarus, for reasons that Professor Cronin just said, is happy to play along. It's strengthening Lukashenko's position. And just recently, Belarus announced that it would accept the stationing on Belarusian soil of Russian nuclear weapons. So it could be perceived from a Russian point of view of, again, a loose federation, Ukraine, Belarus. Russia, again, might be part of the bottom line. But to answer from what I think, from what people who actually are following this very closely seem to think is Putin's bottom line, he wants to be considered a major player. He expects, in essence, to recreate for Russia the role that the Soviet Union had once played, and has been very explicit and direct about saying all countries are sovereign, but some countries are much more sovereign than others. And he outright said there are 4 countries, only 4 in the world, that have the right to decide who can join and be part of alliances. And those 4 countries, according to Putin, are the US, Russia, China, and India. So that's a bottom line that certainly NATO, Europe, the US is not going to be able to accept, but those are the cards that he's put down on the table. I don't know if Professor Leonard has more to add on that as a Europeanist. But
I don't, and I actually, unfortunately, I too have to run because I have another.
I thought you would, but listen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
think we have one or two really small questions. We'll finish up there, and thank you so much for bringing the context into it. So
Thanks, Sarah.
great. I think the other question that Michael, that I hadn't seen out there was, is this connected in a way to the Orange Revolution?
Oh, we need a historian for that. I don't know.
I would say yes, in the sense of the Orange Revolution encouraged Europe, the EU, NATO, the US to reinforce our shared values for liberal world order, which would bring Ukraine more in the orbit of the rest of Europe, which is seen as a threat by Russia. So, and the last question that I think is still out there, and unless there's others that people want to jump in, was just the role that, does Ukraine have any leverage with its resources, its gas in particular? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't. In fact, very much the contrary. The gas comes from Russia, where Ukraine had a good deal of leverage. Is the pipeline traveled overland, and so that meant Ukraine essential for Russia to be able to sell its gas to Europe, and that's why the Nord Stream pipelines were so controversial. Even at the time, people were saying, don't do this. In other words, don't put those pipelines under the Baltic Sea. Keep them overland. One, it's ecologically better, many people said. But secondly, once that happens, Russia will be able to act with more impunity in Ukraine. And that is exactly what's happened. It's also starving Ukraine of the revenues that it had from the transport of
the tax that they got for allowing it to happen under theirs. Yeah.
Great. Well, listen, I'd just like to thank everyone for participating. Terrific having a guest from Monmouth today, and Professor Cronin, thank you very much. The perspectives were unique that you offered and added a lot to the discussion. And as you know, Department of International Relations and the Warburg program welcomes opportunities to talk with folks on issues of interest, and look forward to the next chance that we'd be able to do so with you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And a shout out to my Monmouth crews that I see joined us today as well. Thank you.
And listen, one last question. Will it be available to view again? Yes, it will, thanks to the wonderful people in IT that put the webinar together. So that should be coming out in a day or two.
Great.
Take care. Thanks.
Have a good day, everyone.